All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Writing Quest. My name is Brendan Pugh, and today we have Isaac Hill with us, and we're going to talk about his self-publishing journey, his book, just kind of chat about writing. How you doing? And why don't you dive in by just telling us who you are and what you've written and where you're going?
Sure. First off, thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk about writing. So I'm Isaac Hill. I'm a newly self-published fantasy author, and I am the author of the Dragon Legion. So it's a fantasy series. It's a generational series about one family's quest to regain their lost empire, and it starts off with our main character in the Dragon Legion, Dre Sunborn, who's a member of the Second Legion. He's also a prince, and the Second Legion is a legion of criminals that gets sent to the north to combat some unruly tribes. And then in the north, he and his friends find that not all is as it seems, and that's where the real adventure begins.
Yeah, nice. I'm looking at the cover. Is it kind of what kind of cultures do you have? It looks like it's kind of like Asian inspired, Asian culture.
So, what is funny is, I started this writing journey seriously a couple of years back in the middle of the pandemic, and like everyone that starts writing, I wrote a couple of doozies, trunk books. I later learned they're
Mhm.
called that will never see the light of day. And so one of those was my first NaNoWriMo, and another one of them was the first book about the Sunborn family. And so I had this idea that, you know, there might be this group of people who ran a kingdom who used to have an empire. And in the middle of the night, this young boy gets woken up by his father and his father's guards and torn from his bed because they're in the middle of a coup and one of their generals is taking over the country. And so I wrote that whole book, and it was horrible.
Yeah.
It was really bad. So I wrote that whole book. I printed it off. I started editing, and I went, "Oof, this is really bad." But the one character that I loved was that character's grandfather, Dre Sunborn, and so I decided to write about him and his Dragon Legion. And I found that I was really writing about kind of let's say, a Gaelic inspired Gallic group of people who were heavily influenced by the Romans and the Britons and tribes of that ilk in that era.
Yeah. Nice. That's cool. Yeah, I love the I love that I feel like the I don't know if you have any actual dragons in the book or not, but I do like the dragon imagery because I feel like a lot of people got away from that for quite a while because of I don't know, maybe like Aragon came out and everyone was doing dragons or something. But I'm glad to be seeing that more. Just even the imagery of it in general is cool to see.
Well, now this was the strange part about writing a fantasy novel about the Dragon Legion. Like famously, England had a Dragon Legion, and it was used to quell rebellions. Let's say
Hmm.
kindly.
Yeah,
Um,
in a nice way.
yeah, let's. And then there's the Pendragon of the Welsh, and so the iconography, and of course the Asian inspired iconography of the dragons.
Yeah.
But it was a symbol of power. It was a symbol of warfare, and so I that's what I gravitated towards. And in my mind, I could see, and it's explained later at the end of the book, that this pennant would inspire fear.
Yeah.
It wasn't that there are dragons; it was that these men were as brave as ferocious as dragons, and that's why I picked the symbology or the iconography of it.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. I love that you clearly done your research about it and you know what it meant and what it means to the story, and I really like that. That's cool. So how did you give us a little bit of your background of like had you written a lot before? What made you eventually decide, okay, I'm going to actually pursue this? Like kind of maybe give us that background.
Sure, sure, yeah. So it's I think like many let's call myself middle-aged men,
Hmm.
I had a long journey towards writing. to kind of finally pull the trigger. And so I remember I was talking to Nicholas Fuller the other day. I remember distinctly writing stories in elementary school. And so, like, I wrote this story about an orc who finds the one ring, in some magma in
Mm-hmm.
Mordor after the ring is thrown into Mount Doom. And then, little snippets of writing stories and creative writing. And then in high school, a friend of mine, Jason, um, got, I would say, moderately serious about writing and started writing books. Started out to write books at least. And I got partway through writing a book about werewolves, and then, like everybody else at that time. And then kind of the interest wasn't there. I was interested in different things and doing different things. And um, it wasn't until the pandemic hit that I sat down and in talking to my wife, I realized, I really want to write and I want to tell stories. And I wasn't a good writer. And so, that inspiration came from listening to other people and watching other people's writing journeys on self-publishing shows and listening to authors like Mark Greaney and um, creatives like Stephen Pressfield. And I just sat down and started writing. And so the first book that I started writing in the pandemic turned out to really be about Indiana Jones, which was ironic. Like,
Mm-hmm.
he was in Egypt and he was a spy, and there was a
Right.
little sidekick character, a little boy that tipped him off, and it
Yeah.
was pretty bad. So
Mm-hmm.
I stopped writing that, and and then I started exploring this idea of how do you get better at writing and telling stories?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that there's distinct differences. Telling stories is a skill set, and writing is a skill set. And you can be good at telling stories, and you can be good at writing, and sometimes you're not good at both. I
Mm-hmm.
was bad at writing, and so I started practicing. So I just wrote a lot. And then over time, I found a group, of in-person group, a writing group, that I started going to after writing a couple of books and getting some feedback from some friends and family. I went to this group, and they gave me very good feedback on what was missing in my writing. Simple things like, when I was writing, I was very sparse on description, setting. I
Mm-hmm.
was very much action oriented, and I thought that's what made good writing. But it's that combination of things that you find, and people often talk about finding your voice through writing, and it took me years and multiple books and multiple iterations of books to find kind of my groove in this. So after a long period of time of dragging my heels and talking about it and thinking about it and talking about it, I found a group called the Break-ins that
Mm-hmm.
Brian Wilson and Rob and Sam and Josh and Adrian, a whole gang of us are all part of. And they were the ones that kind of pushed me towards that. You can do this. You can self-publish if you want to. I had that goal in the back of my mind, but I don't know that I was as confident that I could execute on it without that kind of support of other people going through the same process and experience. Because when it comes to self-publishing, it's really, again, two pieces. There's telling stories and writing books, and then there's the business of selling books. So
Mm-hmm.
the self-publishing part of hiring the right editor, hiring the right designer, a cover artist, making sure that you get proofread, that you get arcs out, that do the tech side. How do you embed code for using the different links and add-ons to your website? So that part, I really found a group of authors that helped me through that process to get me to here, which is book one published.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I really like how you draw the distinction between telling stories and writing, because they are very different. And I similar for me. I remember, so I have one finished manuscript that no one will ever read because it's horrible. And I remember finishing it and having that moment of like, I'm super proud of myself for having finished this. But then going back and same thing, kind of reading through it, starting to edit and being like, nope, this is not good. you know, I remember, same thing. Like my wife and we work on like creative stuff together, and um, but I remember the very first time, same thing. I never, I love stories. I'd never really written, and then I decided to write something, and I remember kind of giving her the first little chapter that I'd written of something, and she just very politely told me like how bad it was, in a very loving, nice way, of course. But so yeah, that's definitely something of like, and even in those moments, it's like she could see. I see that there is a story here. Just
Mm,
the how you're actually writing it is not working. So that's a cool distinction to bring. My brother, my younger brother, who's kind of, I guess, maybe my writing partner. Like if we're both writing stuff and we always kind of go back and forth. We talk about all the time, and this was maybe like last year, and I've been working on stuff on and off for a long time, and he read something I wrote, and he goes, I think you're finally getting the hang of this to where maybe someday you'll be like, thanks for, after all these years, I'm like finally getting the hang of it.
well, that's the crazy part about this writing journey is it takes years. Like
Hmm.
people talk about on writing as kind of the seminal work on craft, and Stephen King talks about writing for his entire life
Yeah.
because that's what it takes to get proficient and good. It is not the norm to wake up and write a bestseller your first go round. Like it is, you know, it is something you can practice. It is
Yeah.
skill.
Well, I mean, I think people do that all the time where they compare themselves to a Stephen King or a Brandon Sanderson, like where he's writing so many books so fast. And it's easy to compare yourself to that, but then to be like, I mean, these guys have been doing this for years and years. And not only that, they also have huge teams of people around them to like help them beta read and all sorts of stuff. Like uh, Brandon Sanderson has this famous writing group that he's constantly, as he's writing stuff, they're going over it with him. So
Mm-hmm.
you got to, people definitely have to learn to give themselves that grace of like, it's okay to take your time and just and learn what you're doing. And that was big for me. I always felt like I had to, I'm mid 30s now, and I always felt like I had to get it out like right now while I'm young. And now I'm kind of transition of like, well, if I get it when I'm in my 40s, maybe, or like whenever it happens is when it's supposed to happen. But
Absolutely.
I want to work on it, and I want it to be good before that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, 100% on the same journey as you. I've got a friend, Bruce, and he was an editor and a writer throughout his life. And I remember him telling me, you know, this is a process that's going to take you a long time. And I remember him picking up, actually, ironically, the Dragon Legion, the first draft. And he sat me down. And he said, "Listen, good story. 7 out of 10. You can fix some things in here, and there's some things you can add for a story." He said, "Writing, mm, not seven
Hmm.
out of ten." And it's
Yeah.
those are the things, like those are the lumps you have to take in the journey to making something good. And I had this very strange mental blockage when it came to editing. I just thought, well, why do you have to edit? Like when it comes out,
Hmm.
it's good. And that's another fallacy that we all kind of fall into when we first start writing. I find it, most of us at least, that you write something, you're like, hey, here it is. But like
Hmm.
the editing, that's the magic. Like that's the real magic, is going back and cleaning it up and taking another pass and adding little tidbits and little sensory inputs and experiences to the scene or
Hmm.
chapter that make a big difference. So we're on a boat, maybe it's swaying, maybe it hits a wave, and maybe the characters are swaying, and at the same time as they're swaying, you can see that one of them doesn't belong on a boat,
Hmm.
right? And that gives you your background, and that's what you can do with editing. That's very powerful, that you can't do with your first draft sometimes,
Yeah.
which is equally a part of writing.
I find that so one of the things I've started to kind of do is I found that I kind of chronically underwrite. So like
Mm,
I write a chapter, and in it, just for numbers, say it ends up being like 2,000 words in this chapter or something. And then I find after I go back and read it that it's like I got myself from point A to point B, but I missed a bunch of stuff that probably should be in there. So one of the things I've been starting to do is like whenever I go after I write something, if I go back, I do like kind of an additive draft. So like I don't take anything away, but I just try to add more, add sentences, add a paragraph here because I find that I don't add in enough description or I don't add in enough what's this character feeling, and so I try to do that. This it's not I don't really want to call it a second draft because I don't like change it, but I what can I add to this to tell the same thing but better, you know?
I give myself the credit of calling that my second draft because I'm the same. I'll go
Mm-hmm.
back and it'll be like, well, how did we get to this knife fight? It's like,
Right.
well, we got angry. And so like I'm the exact same way as you. Like I just wrote a novella, a pre Dragon Legion to explain how Dre ends up in a legion of criminals, even though he's a prince of Landor.
Mm-hmm.
And it started at 10,000 finished first draft, and second draft is almost 13, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not done
Yeah.
for the second edit because I think you'd got to take credit for those things. The putting
Mm-hmm.
in, I'm the same way.
Yeah, for sure. So it sounds like you never really you wanted to self-publish from the beginning, but have you thought it ever about traditional publishing? Did you consider that like were you always just kind of like I want to self-publish and that's the way I want to go?
It's a good question. You know, I've been back and forth the whole time. So
Mm-hmm.
I had very interesting experiences trying to get myself published because I thought, you know, traditional publishing was the route to go initially. And I think that I wanted that kind of external validation of, yeah, this writing is good enough, which, you know, to a point, it is part of the threshold, right? To get
Mm-hmm.
traditionally published is you need a certain quality of writing. And so I did submit, I think, three different books to traditional publishers, well, actually to agents.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so a number of times I had submitted fantasy books. And the last go around, I submitted a fully written magical realism fantasy book about a street magician, Busker, who loses
Mm-hmm.
his body in the 1700s, 1800s London and has to get it back and finds himself in the middle of a plot to assassinate the queen. And
Mm-hmm.
so that garnished a lot of responses very quickly um, because the premise was interesting,
Mm-hmm.
but all of them were rejections. I actually got
Yeah.
one a couple of weeks ago, and I think I submitted that to a number of agents last year. So I started
Yeah.
on that route and that journey, and I ended up making the decision that um, good, better, best. It is better to get something out there and begin building my career, my fan base, and my publishing resume to start this journey. I wanted to tell stories, and I wanted to tell stories to readers, and self-publishing this book was my route to do that.
Yeah. Sounds like I think that's a great thing, that you have to have the inherent core value almost of like I want to tell stories no matter what. I want to write no matter what. And then how that eventually comes to be is however it works is fine, but that initial drive is like I want to tell good stories. And I think if you have that, you have a great foundation.
Yeah, I had the because I had the same. I had the funny enough the same experience as you. I gave the first 50 pages of one of my books to my wife to read.
Hmm.
I said, you know, let me know what your feedback is. I wasn't in a place to receive feedback very well. I wasn't
Hmm.
practicing receiving feedback. And she gave me her feedback, and she's like, "This is not the right start to this book." And I just thought, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
That's the perfect start. I wrote it,
You can get
but
so defensive about it like this is what do you mean it doesn't
yeah,
work? Yeah.
exactly. And then in my time in writing groups, getting feedback constantly
Hmm.
on making things better, you begin to understand that it is about telling the story as best you can, and the reader ultimately is right. So
Hmm.
when someone reads your work, if you want to tell stories, the measure of your success is how well a reader can understand it. It doesn't mean they're going to like it, but if
Hmm.
they understand your story, you can write it well enough for them to understand. I think that that is, that is core to the craft.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, I suppose, maybe something to be said for like writing stories for yourself. And if you like them, that's great. But I agree with you. I think, if you look at any of the big, like Lord of the Rings, obviously, and then if you look at Harry Potter, like those stories are surviving for generations upon generations upon generations because of readers, not because of the authors. The author was able to tap into something that the readers, no matter how many generations of people read Lord of the Rings, it just seems like they just keep having that same experience everyone else had, and it just keeps going on. I think I agree with you. That's the measure of you found something that actually means something to someone.
Yeah, like the resonance. What is the frequency that resonates inside of your story, right? I had a very weird experience with reviews of this book, and my future plan. So initially, when I released this book on the 14th of May, I had I had already had 97,000 words of the second book ready,
Hmm.
um, and I was well on my way to. I had a plan to finish it, and the feedback I got was this character, this reluctant prince who does not want the crown, is a good character and an interesting character, and people are excited to see where he goes. He
Hmm.
was not going to be in book two. But because I'm a self published author, I get to make a choice, and my choice is the generational story that I'm telling is now going to be probably about 5 generations. And so we're
Hmm.
going to see what happens with Dre's son and Dre
Hmm.
in the next book, because it piqued interest. And I think that, to your point, if something catches, you need to listen to your readers.
Yeah. I think also, famously, I think a lot of people or a lot of creators right now don't listen to their audiences enough. And I think, you can't listen to everything, of course. Like you have to take the good and the bad from everyone's going to have an opinion about your writing and stuff. But you definitely, I mean, if a large majority of the people reading your work are shifting a certain direction, that's something to listen to at least to say, should I continue on with this character or how. Um, I think of Jar Jar Binks from Star Wars actually comes to mind for the reason of he was a huge part of that first movie, and then everyone was like, nope, we do not like this character, and then for the next ones he wasn't in it so much, and so it's one of those. Yeah, you definitely have to pay attention to what it's like a social contract. Like, hey, I'm gonna write these books, and I'm gonna try to, I want to create the story I want to create, but also I need your feedback, and I will listen to some of that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
I absolutely agree. Initially I didn't feel that way as an
Hmm.
author. I thought, well, I'm going to tell my story the way I want to tell it, and darn it, that's it. And then I've since come to the conclusion that I want to tell stories, and I want people to enjoy those stories. And sometimes their feedback can inform telling a better story. And
Hmm.
isn't that the goal? To tell a better story, to write a better story, to immerse yourself in what you do.
Yeah. I also, and I love your input on this, would be I think you can tell a good story. So, like, part of the reason I like to tell stories or want to tell stories is to kind of communicate themes and ideas that are important to me, of things maybe I see in the world that we need more of, or something like that. And you can do that and still have that core message be the same while also adjusting and changing based on feedback and fan favorites and all that kind of stuff. what are your thoughts on that?
Hmm. Um, I think it's necessary.
Hmm.
I think I think if you don't do it, you're in an echo chamber, and then you have to ask yourself, why are you telling stories? Like you
Hmm.
have to ask the question, what is the reason that you do it?
Yeah.
Because if the reason that you do it, it depends on why you do it. There's a lot of people, I'm sure, that just write and never sees the light of day.
Yeah. And, I think, again, it's like if people want to write and just have it for themselves, and, that perfectly fine as well. I think, but ultimately, if you are going to put stuff out there, you have to have that back and forth. And I think with the readers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think the reader is king at the end of the day, and I don't think that I felt that way initially, and I
Hmm.
didn't feel that way about editing either. I thought, well, this story is the way I'm putting it out here, and then I started to think kind of in a very regimented way, a very
Hmm.
a very a very linear way. This is
Hmm.
the story I'm telling. And it's like, well, there's a lot of story and there's a lot of pieces of the story that are not written. So why not let those inputs inform the
Hmm.
story instead of sticking to the path that you've made up, because we're just making stories up.
Yeah. We're
So
making it
why
up.
not change it? Nobody knows what you're going to say next.
Right. Absolutely. So, do you have, kind of pivoting a little to,
Mhm.
um, you have a wife. You said you had a wife. You have a family, I'm assuming. So, how do you kind of, being self-published? What's your, do you have any routines? How do you stay disciplined? How does that kind of work, especially with family life? There's lots of pressures there and lots of different time commitments. So, how does that kind of, how do you get your writing in? I suppose is maybe the question.
Good question. So it's changed dramatically.
Mm.
I've got a little girl and she's about a year old, and so I
They're
wrote,
first.
yeah.
Yeah. I've one daughter, she's 9, and so it's a never-ending ride, man.
It's an amazing experience,
Yeah.
to watch them grow and learn and think. To watch
Hmm.
them really truly think and make decisions for the first time is really fun.
Yeah.
So I think with having my daughter, I've come to appreciate that, in some ways I'm writing stories for her in hopes that
Hmm.
someday she'll pick them up and read them and think, "Wow, Dad, you wrote this?" And I'll say, "Yeah." Or
Yeah.
she'll look at them and say, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, I'm not
She won't
touching that."
appreciate it all, or yeah. It seems like they're either gonna love what you do or have just complete like apathy towards it. Like, yeah, we just, well, I don't know. Dad
Yeah.
does the thing.
Yeah. Well, I listened to an author interview. I think it was Mark Greaney who wrote The Gray Man, and he was saying like his kids don't even look at his books. He's like
Yeah.
one of the most famous thriller authors in the world.
Right.
Sorry to go down the tangent, but how do I find the time, or what is my routine? It's changed quite a bit, obviously. So the start of my day is usually dedicated to taking care of her and getting myself to work, or spending the day with her on the weekends, and my wife. And generally speaking, I do my best to find time after she goes down for the evening, little
Hmm.
tidbits of time. And then on the weekends, usually I try to block an hour and a half to work on either the craft or the business side of things. So usually it's a couple of days, a couple of nights during the week, and one or two sessions on the weekends, and
Yeah.
just pick away.
Yeah, that's great. I think, there's so much. The thing you hear a lot, I think, is, you got to write every day. You got to set a time that's at, 5 a.m. every morning. You're writing for an hour, and I think what I found, when I first started writing, tried to follow some of that advice. And what I found is just life just gets in the
Mm,
way of that, and so finding just those times where, well, tonight after bed or during lunch this day, or I think that's more natural and normal for what people can actually do.
Oh, wholeheartedly agree. I'm reading a nonfiction, Slow Productivity by Cal Newport. I've been a
Oh,
big fan.
it's on my nightstand. I've been reading it. I'm almost at the end.
Oh, it's fantastic. I'm maybe three quarters. Anyways, when he talked about seasonality
Hmm.
and forgiving yourself for not sticking to some of those things, it really resonated with me. I think I wrote in the book the seasonality of what I do now, and or my plan is I'm going to write books, I'm going to edit books, and I'm going to publish them and sell them.
Hmm.
Those are the seasons that I follow. It's not it's I don't think it's one thing. It's many things coming together. I write as much as I can. I went on a
Hmm.
vacation with my wife and little girl, and I was able to write every day. It was fantastic. I wrote a whole novella. Then I
Hmm.
came home, and then I had to do the editing, on the weekends or in the evenings here and there, and that's fine, and that'll take a couple of months. But I don't subscribe to the everyday idealized version anymore because it just you're setting yourself up for probably a little bit too much of a regiment to
Hmm.
find happiness in.
Yeah. So that giving yourself permission and grace to just do what you can when you can. And because for early on for a while, I remember really trying to stick to a, regimented thing because I was like, well, this is what people are saying and I really want to get it done. And I think two things happened eventually. One of them was I feel like my creativity really took a nosedive because I was forcing myself to write, and I feel like most of the stuff that I forced myself to write, I ended up getting rid of or didn't like or whatever. And then the other thing was I was just driving myself crazy. Like
Mm,
I was really like, I didn't write today, so I'm a bad person, or like that mental game of, well, I didn't do it, so I failed. Um, and neither one of those things is very healthy. I don't think.
yep. Yep. No, I absolutely agree with you. It's like setting up the parameters for what you want to end up with and giving yourself enough time to get there. So,
Yeah.
book two is after I finish editing the novella and get it into a good state. I start writing book two, and that'll take me months.
Hmm.
It's about the long haul, right? The
Hmm.
writing a book takes forever.
Hmm.
And so you just pick away at it. I know lots of authors write in spurts. They'll
Hmm.
write, a book in 3 weeks, and but the work that goes into the editing, the work that goes into the crafting, the picking of the cover art, all those things take a very long time. So writing is a long game.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Cal Newport. I love all of his books. They're all, I don't know how many of his you've actually read. Um, but yeah, his books are really great, and this slow practice. Most of them have been helpful to me, but not to go on too much of a tangent. But the slow productivity one that is has kind of the same, like reinforced for me to have permission to, like, if you're in a busy season of work, it's okay to set it aside for a minute, and then once you have time again, open it back up to having a season where you write a lot. I think I was already kind of doing it naturally. Even like one week, I will just write all the time. Like I just am
Mhm.
really motivated to do it, and then the next month I struggle. Like so. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned him because I his books are great. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, yeah, me too. I found him a couple of years ago with Deep Work, and so good they can't ignore you, and
Hmm.
I've been a big fan ever since. I
Yeah.
think there's this like mystique around writing and art, and I'm a big fan of Pressfield as well, Stephen Pressfield and the Muse
Hmm.
and Resistance, and there's this thought process that some of us are naturally gifted.
Hmm.
We're touched by the Muse, and we can kind of channel this art, but really the truth of it is these are skills that you can build.
Yeah.
And that's like it took me a long time to sort that out in my mind, like in writing, that the reason that NaNoWriMo is a lot of fun, challenging but fun, is because it forces you to work on writing and
Yeah.
write a lot. And that is what ends up becoming a good story.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And just that idea of like, um, when people say like you can grow up and be anything you want to be, that's true if you work really hard at it.
Yeah.
You know, like I
Yep.
can't grow up and say I'm going to be a football player unless I really go out there and I work very hard at being a football player. And so that's like the key thing of like if you work really hard at it for a long time.
Yeah, and there's limits, right? There's always limits to the time that you have, the access that you have. You can make do with a lot, but there's always, there's going to be choices and sacrifices you need to make to get to where you want to be, and building those skills takes a long time, no matter what the path you choose. Like you
Hmm.
mentioned, if it's being a football player, that means going to the gym, that means running, that means studying plays. There's a everything that you choose to do will take something to be successful in.
Yeah. So if for the aspiring writer out there, maybe a young kid who's wanting to write, or someone our age who has never done so but is thinking about it, what what's some advice maybe you'd give someone for starting out if they're like I've never written anything before but I want to? What would you tell them?
I've been thinking a lot about that question. What now that I've published a book, and in theory you call me a published author,
Hmm.
uh, what would I tell somebody else? Uh, I don't think that having written a couple of books and published one of them that I'm an authority. So I would
Hmm.
say I can only really speak to my experience. And my experience would be that it is helpful to have an outline if you want one or not. It's helpful to write regularly when you can, and to edit and take a step back and think about story and theme and characters and setting. All of those things are helpful, but what you really need to do is find the process that works for you. We were talking about seasonality, and seasonality seems to really work for me. Work
Hmm.
on a book really hard, edit the book, get it ready, and then go ahead with the business side of things. I think anyone who wants to tell stories and write stories more specifically, um, there is nothing stopping you. You can share it or not. You just have to sit down occasionally or regularly and write.
Hmm.
It
Yeah.
is There is no magic to it. It is like very monotonous, and it feels odd in how normal it is. You just sit down and write by
Hmm.
hand, by computer. I wrote my novella on a Bluetooth portable keyboard that hooks up to my phone via Bluetooth that I bought a decade ago at
Yeah.
a source store that sell electronics. 1999. Didn't even change the batteries. I've had it for 10 years. It tells you how much I used it.
Yeah.
But I wrote a novella on it. Not a fancy computer, just that and a little notebook.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Anyone can do it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the one thing I wish I would have maybe done when I first started was, and this is maybe the hardest part, is getting good feedback sooner. Like for a long time, I was really afraid to even ask anyone to give anyone even a snippet of what I was, or even tell people that I was writing. Like it seemed like such a like you tell people like, what do you mean you're writing? That's weird. Like
Yeah.
it was so hard to even. So I think that would be what I would say too. Is like, don't be afraid to get out. Like people will be less vicious than you think. There'll be some people out there who maybe are not so nice about it, but most 95% of people are going to be like, wow, that's really cool. And so, but I think if you can find some trusted people to like, hey, what do you think about this? I think that would help people learn faster, is that feedback sooner, perhaps.
Absolutely. I spent many years talking to almost no one about what I was doing with all of my spare time.
Yeah.
And the since I've published this book, I've told friends and family and my social circles that I'm actually a writer and I've been working on this for a long time.
Hmm.
And the feedback, like you said, has been fantastic and very positive and well received. And I think I would credit my writing ability with that feedback, going out and seeking the feedback of others um, in my writing group and within my social circles has been very helpful to informing how to tell a story better and how to write better.
Yeah. So you've mentioned your writing group a couple of times. Is that something that um, you find to be crucial? Is that something you do like occasionally you're in a writing group, occasionally you're not? And if so, like, where would you rate that, I suppose, on your scale of importance, like having a writing group versus not having a writing group?
Sure. So I'm part of two writing groups. I've got a
Hmm.
writing group that I go to, Writers Together Halifax, and we meet every week or so, and we talk about our writing and we get feedback from each other. I'm in the Break-ins, which
Hmm.
is a group of indie publishing authors that you've had a couple of them on, and
Hmm.
we are all working towards our publishing, within this kind of 12 to 24 month time frame. And I would credit those groups with helping me to publish this work and make it good. Um, I don't know that you can quantify it, but I would
Hmm.
say I think they are definitely in large part part of my success.
Hmm.
Uh, Part of the reason that I was able to do this. Very supportive. I think that you need to find a community and you need to be part of that community of support to be successful in this kind of work. It's a very, very lonely business to be
Hmm.
in, to sit down and write for hours on end. It's just yourself and your characters. So to be able
Hmm.
to talk to other people about it is very enjoyable. And finding some objective opinions that are not your spouse or your best friend or your aunt or uncle is also very helpful. It's very helpful because it helps you to understand someone else's perspective that has a different view than you do.
Hmm. Yeah, I found sharing in a writing group, especially the one that I haven't been in a while, but the one that I was going to sharing. Um, Not everyone was a fantasy or sci-fi person, so you had some people who were maybe they're writing romance or literary fiction, or so we had some fantasy people. Having the people who don't write sci-fi or fantasy, I always felt like if I could get them to understand what's going on, that would be a big win. But then I also really valued a lot of their feedback because even if maybe their suggestion wouldn't actually work, the
Mm.
um, the fact that they even asked the question kind of helped me formulate a better question to help me fix what they were questioning. You know what I mean?
It tells you something. I'm
Yeah.
100% with you. I've got one of my writing groups, one of my writing friends, RJ. She told me one time I was reading the scene. She said, "I think you've been kind of leaning on this campfire scene." So what do you mean? She said, "I think you've got four of them so far," and that informed me to say, "Hey, listen, like this is boring."
Hmm.
She was correct. It doesn't work. You can't just keep going back to the well on the same structure of a scene to inform your plot or your characters or your narrative, right? It's
Yeah.
I think all feedback is good feedback, and to your point, with the exception of the break-ins, the other writing group I'm in, Writers Together Halifax, all of them write different than me, whether
Yeah.
it's sci-fi, literary, um, historical. They're all writing different stuff, and I think that actually gives me very valuable feedback because if they may not know exactly what's wrong, but they can tell from a story lens that something's not working for the story.
Hmm. Yeah. Definitely. I think that's almost been more valuable to me than talking with other authors that write the same way because again, it just makes you think differently. So yeah, I totally agree. I think so. On the line of genres and different writers and stuff, do you? what other kind of genres influence your story and what you put together? Are there any like, do you have more romance elements? Do you have more humor elements? Like, how did it? Did any of those? Do you have any of those other influences in your genres for your story?
All of them.
Hmm.
I read as much as I possibly can. I listened to you and Brian talk about Red Rising.
Hmm.
It is one of my favorite books, and Pierce Brown is one of my favorite authors, and he does a
Hmm.
very good blend as well. So I've tried to incorporate sci-fi elements of the genre, if not the actual sci-fi. I try to incorporate a little bit of romance because I think that romance and family is part of life. And if you want a character that's real and characters that are real,
Hmm.
you need to give a little slice of their life. I've got elements of military fantasy. I've got elements of historical fantasy. I've got a little bit of elements of the thriller genre because I think that you need to make things exciting and kind of take from those different styles of writing. I read as much as I can. With a little bit more limited time, like everybody else at this stage in my
Hmm.
life, but I think that I let all of those things inform me, and I do my best to kind of learn lessons from them because in every genre there are masters of the craft. David Morrell, Jack Carr, um, you've got Anthony Ryan on this side of the house, Brandon Sanderson, Brian
Hmm.
McClellan, Pierce Brown, and then you've got the old masters like J.R.R. Tolkien.
Hmm.
You learn from all of that craft, and I think you need to kind of weave all elements in from all genres. Everyone does something very well, and you
Yeah.
can learn from them, and it just makes a better story. One of our break-ins, Sam Paisley, he wrote the Elements of Time, and he has a really good saying, and I like to steal it from time to time. Everything is in service of the story,
Hmm.
and so like that's how I think about it now. I don't have any ego in it. It's what makes it a better story.
Hmm. I love what you
That's
said there about having uh, romance and stuff and those types of things in there to like, even if the character isn't human, that's what helps ground them into something you can relate to.
yeah,
And everyone, has people that they love, people that they work with, people that they don't like. There's all those interdynamics with people, and finding ways to put those in there. That's what actually makes you connect to it's not really the plot. It's not really the plot is what happens to and around the character, but that those real moments are what actually make you love a character and connect with the character.
absolutely. Like, and I think that the biggest lesson I learned there was it's also your other characters. It's
Hmm.
not just your protagonist, it's your secondary, as they call them, characters. So, like,
Hmm.
two of my characters have kind of a subplot of, the reason they want to get home is they want to go see their mother.
Hmm.
They're two brothers, and they just love their family, and everything kind of leads back to that for them. That is their motivation, and you need to give people a slice of your character's life, which is going to be different and strange and interesting, and that's your job as an author is to show them that these are people inside of your story.
Hmm.
And I think character driven writing is kind of what pushes us through a plot. And so I
Hmm.
do my best to make my characters interesting and give them motivation and give them a story that is worthy of them.
Yeah. I just had a comment on a YouTube video recently. I'm not going to remember it exactly, but it was someone who was new to writing, and they were basically asking, like, you know, what's more important, plot or character, and how do you? I think they heard someone had given them some advice, and they were just asking, and so my response basically was, I don't know if there's one that's more important, but if I was forced to pick and give an answer, I would say character. The reason I would say that is I used Harry Potter as an example. the reason that pretty much everyone loves that story is because it's not a story about Voldemort and magic. That's not the story. The story is about Harry, who no one has ever loved him. He grew up without that, and he's just trying to fit in. That's what the story is. It's the story is Harry Potter trying to fit into the world around him and find someone to love him. And that is something we can all understand and all resonate with. And
Absolutely.
those are the kinds of things to me that make the story.
Yeah, it's it's funny we talk a lot in writing and as authors about archetypal characters, archetypes, and we talk a lot about tropes, and we talk a lot about themes that get used regularly in structure, and all of those things are inputs into a story. And generally speaking, it starts and ends with the characters that are in your
Mm-hmm.
story. You want them to be relatable. You want people to understand them. They don't have to agree with them, but
Mm-hmm.
we want them to understand, why is this person doing this or thing, if they're not a person per
Mm-hmm.
se, and can I relate to it? Thanos is the perfect example.
He's a great example. Yeah.
Don't agree with them, but you can say, okay, I understand why you might do that. I
Mm-hmm.
can, I think you're, obviously off the rocker, but he's understandable.
Yeah.
Doesn't I don't know if relatable is the right word, but you can usually make your protagonist relatable in a good way,
Mm-hmm.
to keep people interested. But even your villains need to be understandable.
Yeah. With Thanos is probably one of the best examples. I what I've always said about him is like I understand where he's coming from, and I also agree with that something should be done. What people should not agree with is how he chose to go about it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but understanding what he's trying to accomplish, like that makes perfect sense and is almost in a way a noble goal of he's trying to fix the problem. How
He
he
is,
wants to is the bad idea.
yeah, he's a prime example of, you know, um, good intentions lead to the bad place.
Yeah.
Your good intention leads to a horrible, horrible thing, right? So it's like he is a good example of the fact that the way that you do things is important in a story.
Hmm. And
Because
even another great example is Darth Vader. He's one of the most beloved villains of all time. I think the reason for that though is, I mean, he's a cool villain, of course, but he's the victim. He's the victim of the whole story. He was a good kid who fought in a war and was a war hero, and he like was this great person who was taken advantage of and turned to the dark side. And so again, it's like you can understand where he's coming from. You can empathize with him, even though he becomes this horrible character.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think, and I like it to see multi-dimensional characters. Like my protagonist Dre, um, does not always do good things. He's in
Hmm.
an army, and so inherently, that involves fighting, usually to the death. And so you could say just morally that he has to do things that are not okay.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of the crux of military fantasy. Um, he's defending his nation and doing the best that he can to get back to his life and the kingdom. But you know, you have to go about those things in an honorable way as best you
Hmm.
can in a bad situation sometimes. And how we get there is always the interesting part of the story, right? It's the
Yeah,
twists and turns that we take and how we tell it.
that's what I feel like. Brandon Sanderson balances that well, like in the Stormlight Archive with his characters Kaladin and Dalinar, especially. They're trying to do the right thing, but in the process of that, they do a lot of shady things, and it's just part of the story. But none of us are perfect, and we make mistakes, and that's again what makes it relatable and understandable for people.
Yeah, Lee Child talks about that in I think it may be his BBC class, his master class on writing. He says, you can't let your character become the Superman and become
Hmm.
stronger and better and stronger and better. You need to make sure that they are fallible, that they can make mistakes, and that they can learn from them. And that is what makes it interesting.
Yeah,
You know,
definitely. Well, we're kind of coming up on an hour here, so we can maybe start bringing it to a close. I guess for parting, what would be maybe your for someone who's wanting to go on the self-publishing journey, what would maybe be some of your final advice for them? If you could leave them with a last little pearl of wisdom, what would it be?
if you have stories that you want to tell and you want to get them out there, the means and methods, the tools are all out there for you. Find yourself people in the community to talk to about how to do that if you want advice. We are all happy to share our own experiences and tips and tricks. But good, better, best, get it out there. Take the plunge, like you said. Show people your work. Get some exposure. Take some feedback, and eat the elephant one bite at a time. Just
Hmm.
take your time, write the story, do a good job editing. Do your best to hire some professional help for editing, and it the process will lead you in the right direction. So trust the process. It just takes time.
Hmm. Awesome, love it. Where can we find you? Where can we get your book? Where all that kind of stuff? Social media. Where's all
Sure.
that?
I am isaachillauthor.com, Isaac Hill Author on Instagram, Isaac Hill Author on X and Twitter. And you can find me on Amazon, The Dragon Legion, the Sunborn series. The first book is out right now, and you can buy it there, or you can find me in Kindle Unlimited, and it is free if you're subscribed to read through the book.
Awesome. Cool. We'll put all that. I'll put all that in the description, and we'll have it all linked up there. And it's been great to talk to you for sure. Glad to have you.
It's a pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on. It's when we get to talk about books, time just flies. So that was a really fantastic hour. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this has been Writing Quest, and this is Isaac Hill. Make sure to check out his stuff, and we will see you next time.